SCV chat starts now.
It is a bit past Monday on a 7 o'clock. I'm sick. Give me 1 second. I'll actually say my intro right. It's 7 o'clock on a Monday afternoon, so you know what time it is. It's time for your weekly episode of SCV Chat. I'm your host this evening, Moose. And please remember, before we get started, the views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily the views and opinions of the SCV, its GEC, nor any divisions, brigade, camps, or any other subsidiaries. How is everybody doing in Dixieland tonight? We have a great host for you. He is very knowledgeable, scholar. You chat heads know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Dr. Sandy Mitchum. I'm so excited to have him back. I've been looking forward to this book, talking about it more with him. We talked about it a bit before it came out, I believe, a couple months ago. Now it's out. It's a perfect Christmas present. Hint, hint. But before we get started, we got some quick breaking news to cover from our Chief of Heritage Operations, Mr. Ron Kennedy.
Thank you, Moose. I appreciate that. And I don't want to interlope on Dr. Mitchum's time or anything, but we've been working real hard at headquarters, the Confederate Legion, the Commander-in-Chief, Jason Brochure, Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief, just a whole bunch of folks. We finally managed to get things lined up and conduct a poll, a nationwide poll, asking the American people, or a representative sample of the American people, obviously, whether or not they want to expend military budget dollars. We're talking about millions of dollars just to move the monument at Arlington and rename all of our bases when the military is really hurting. We've got some lower level enlisted folks married who are having to go on food stamps because they can't keep up with their pay doesn't keep up with inflation. And while we're spending millions of dollars to move monuments that's been their ancient monuments, they've been there over 100 years. They were very important at the time. Two different presidents of the United States was there when the monument was put up. Of course, we're talking about the monument in Arlington, Virginia. So we did get the information, the poll data back. And Moose, do you have that graphic that I sent you?
Yes.
All right. And of course, down at the bottom is really where the rubber meets the road. The naming commission, that's the people that's in charge of trying to do this horrible thing. Tax funds should not be used to remove the Arlington Cemetery Memorial. 60% agreed with that statement. That is a very, very good response. 60% of the respondents did not want the government to spend military dollars to remove Arlington's Reconciliation Monument. And that's very important because this monument was put up as a symbol of the North and the South, that bargain, that unwritten bargain that the North and South made after the war. And the South said, yes, we'll remain loyal to the United States. We won't attempt to secede again. Our young men will go into the military. They'll serve this nation. We'll be as much as possible as a part of this nation. So this Reconciliation Monument really represented that. Put that back up again, Moose. There's something on that says I wanted to make sure I got this. Yes, this Reconciliation Monument in Arlington National Cemetery was designed by world-renowned Jewish artist Moses Ezekiel. Now, this is a man who is known worldwide as a sculptor, an artist. He designed that beautiful monument. And the interesting thing, number one, he was a Jewish Confederate veteran who served in the Confederate military. and he wanted to really do a great monument to show the reconciliation between the North and the South, and hopefully that reconciliation would hold. And he is buried. That monument is really part of his grave marker. So not only are they wanting to desecrate the effort to reconcile the North and South, but they're also wanting to desecrate a grave site there in Virginia of Arlington, Virginia, a veterans grave site. And this is a time when we really could spend our money in other much better ways than by trying to remove this. You can take that down now, but we are the Sons of Confederate Veterans and the Confederate Legion, part of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. We work together. We put money to pay for this national polling organization to do the polls. So this wasn't something that the Kennedy twins did, like we did in Louisiana when we polled the Republicans in Louisiana. We did about 1,000 representative samples of that. But this was nationwide, north, south, east, west. And it was very interesting when you look at the details. We don't have time to go over it because I don't want to get over on Sandy's time. But there is support all across the country for us to keep this monument. So tomorrow and the next day, we're going to be sending information out on the Telegraph, the Confederate Legion newsletter, and we're going to be asking our members to contact your congressman, contact your senators, to send this information that you'll be published. That'll be published on the Telegraph and in the Confederate Legion newsletter. Send that as a news release to your local newspapers. Make photocopies and email it to your local agents of influence and to every politician that you think might be positive towards our cause. It's very important. This was an expensive effort. Took a lot of work rushing at the last minute to try to get it done in time. This very great information, it needs to go to Congress, but it also needs to go to your local agents of influence to let them know 60% of America says leave that monument alone. And if you're going to leave that monument alone, let's leave them all alone. Just get your hands off our monuments. Get that information to your local politicians, to your local agents of influence. And again, let me remind you, your local agents of influence, people who are the leaders in the Kiwanis Club, the Knights of Columbus, the Rotary Club, every member of the Chamber of Commerce, you make sure these people get this information. And it's simple as to copy it from what you get on the Telegraph or from the Confederate Legion newsletter. Copy that, just copy it and email it to these people. Very simple, very easy. It can be done. It must be done. This is our opportunity. Commander-in-Chief Jason Brochures has worked very hard to get this accomplished and done. Lieutenant Commander-in-Chief Kennedy has also worked hard on it. I've worked almost without ceasing to get this done, but it doesn't make any difference if just a few of us in national headquarters work to get this done, if the people at the local level don't take this information and use it. So please take this information. If you're not the camp commander, pick up the telephone and call your camp commander and say, listen, there's going to be some information come out in the next day or so from the Telegraph and the Confederate Legion newsletters. We need to get this information to our congressmen, to our senators, to our local elected official, and these agents of influence. I think I've probably filibustered enough of your time, Moose. Do we have Sandy online yet?
Yeah, Dr. Mitchum's in the chat now.
Okay. Well, let me get off the line and listen to Sandy. I don't want to take up all of his time, and because Sandy is a true scholar, and we in the SCV are very lucky to have a man like that.
Amen.
And I am proud to call him a friend. So, again, thank you all for your support, for your effort on the behalf of this cause. Please, please use this information in the next day or two.
Amen. All right, everybody, let's thank Chief of Heritage Operations, Ron Kennedy, for coming on. If you have any questions for him, I can send them to him, and we can talk about it either in a special live episode or something of that standard. Again, thank you, Mr. Ron, for coming on. And without further ado, I'm going to get into tonight's sponsor, and then the main event of the evening happens. We have a legend. I'm doing this now because he can't defend himself. Dr. Samuel Mitchum Jr. coming on the show, author of many, many great books, all that keep me hoping that after I get out of college, I can actually get an education. So tonight's sponsor is, of course, Southern Flags and Quilts. Southern Flags and Quilts make great quality, historically accurate flags. And guess what? You're not sending your money to some Yankee up north. You're not sending it overseas. You're sending it to someone that's a fellow Southerner. And some people say she lives in the heart of Dixie. I would personally say the heart of Dixie is Mississippi. But she's an Alabamian. She works very hard to get all her stuff out there. Great quality work. And again, if you do not believe me, here are a couple, just a taste of her fine work. We have a Tennessee flag, a forest flag, this flag, a Louisiana flag, this one, a Metcalf flag. See here. That one, we got a Mississippi battalion flag. I love that one. And then again, I'm speaking from experience because she made us here at SCV Chat an SCV Chat flag. It is a great quality. I cannot tell you how awesome it is to have someone that cares about the Southern heritage and history like we all do, putting their love into this work. You can feel her connection to her heritage and love for our history in each flag she makes. So please go support Southern Flags and Quilts on Facebook. Link is in the chat below. Message her today and see what type of flag she can make you. All right, without further ado, we're going to get into a quick commercial break. And when we get back, we will have the legend coming on to talk about his newest book. And we will see you after the break.
When my mother was in college, she danced with Confederate veterans. To me, it wasn't that far away. You know, my father knew this. My mother knew this. Almost 50 years ago, I joined the Sons of Confederate Veterans. In those days, we weren't concerned about saving monuments or any of those things. That wasn't necessary. In fact, none of us had any remote idea that it would ever come up. We can't just sit there and react. We have to be proactive. Or, as Robert E. Lee said, the best way to disrupt your enemy's plans is to strike first. Everyone should do all in his power to collect and disseminate the truth, in the hope that it may find a place in history and descend to posterity. History is not the relation of campaigns and battles and generals or other individuals, but that which shows the principles for which the South contended and which justified her struggle for those principles. If you're looking for some place to be where you think you're going to accomplish something to save our history, go to the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I'm Thomas Lee Jesse. I'm a descendant of Private Daughtery Gilmer, a Confederate veteran.
All right, chat heads, we're back. We got the legend on with us, Dr. Sandy Mitchum Jr., and he's here to talk about Voices from the Confederacy. It is an amazing new book out. Link will be, of course, in the chat if you want to go buy it, and I would recommend it. It's also a great Christmas present. Here's what the book looks like. There's the cover, a very beautiful cover, I do have to say. And let me tell you, it looks better with it in hard copy. I'm glad to have Dr. Mitchum back on. It's always a great episode we're on, sir. And let's just dive into it. Anything you want to say about the book per se before we get started into some bigger questions?
Well, first of all, some people think that the fellow on the cover is a Yankee because he's in a blue uniform. He's not. That's General Bernard B. about an hour before he was mortally wounded. He's rallying the 4th Alabama. I just thought I'd clear that up.
Well, that was actually one of my questions I was going to ask you. And it wasn't just to, slander the cover, but to know why you would put someone on there. But it is a very beautiful cover, and that's awesome fact to know. But we're going to ask, we got a couple questions here for you. The first one is, what is the Voices from the Confederacy about?
It's war stories. It's just for fun. It's stories of the individual soldiers. I did that Encyclopedia of Confederate Generals, which was massive. I got to the lower ranks, privates. Sergeant Major Johnston produced an interesting manuscript. He was a 21-year-old Sergeant Major. Nurses, women, slaves, just the hodgepodge of the so-called ordinary citizen and ordinary soldier. It's about them.
And that is an awesome book. And I believe you said this, and again, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but a lot of times, a lot of people focus on the big names in the war, and so I think that's why a lot of people are interested in this book and here to watch us talk about it, is because it's talking about the more common soldier. It's talking about the stories you don't hear anymore, sadly, the ones that were passed down by family.
Yes, I dug into a lot of it, and Google Books was very helpful. If the book was written before about 1923, and virtually all of them were, the copyright's expired, so you can use it. And they had some great stories. I really enjoyed Phoebe Pender, for example. She was a Jewish widow woman who the Secretary of War decided was extremely competent, and he asked her to run a hospital. She had no medical background. She objected. I don't know anything about hospital administration. And the secretary said, well, neither does anybody else, but I know you to be competent. I want you to run it. And she did. She ran Chimborazo Hospital there in Richmond, which is now the home of the Confederate Medical Museum, and did a great job. And she treated over 76,000 wounded or sick Confederates. And of course, Lee's army very rarely had that many men. She did a great job. They even honored her with a postage stamp, a U.S. postage stamp in 1955. I don't think they'd do that today.
But, sadly, they probably wouldn't. You talked about Google, but what were some of your other sources? Because I know sometimes it's hard to find these. I'm writing a book myself, and I feel like I get lost 99% of the time.
Oh golly, I hadn't even thought of that question. Just stories from individuals. The Sons of Confederate Veterans contributed some stories about their ancestors. The memoirs, collections, the slave narratives was a good source. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project came up. They were employing historians during the Great Depression. They couldn't find a job anywhere else, so they sent them out to interview former slaves, and they interviewed hundreds of them. And it gives you a great insight into what the Black people went through and what they did. Incidentally, occasionally the Southerner would call the African American a slave, but most of the time they called them servants, and they respected the older ones. They called the older ones aunt thus and so, uncle thus and so. Even though obviously there was no blood relationship there, but it was impressive. The blacks did not hate the whites like some people would have you believe. In fact, there are a lot of myths, probably more about the slaves than anything else. If you watched Roots and saw Kunta Kinte, you know less than nothing about it. What was this? Kunta Kinte was what, a Senegambian warrior? And two white guys on horseback snuck up on him in the jungle, which is laughable, and snatched him up with a fish net. You know, if I wanted to commit suicide, trying that on one of those people would be a pretty good way to go about it. You'd get a spear stuck up your nose. The slavers were not tired of living. What they did, they set up business relationships with African chieftains who actually enslaved other blacks and sold them to the white people, who usually were located on offshore islands, so that they wouldn't be wiped out. That was the worst part of the journey into slavery, was the Middle Passage between Africa and North America. Incidentally, the slave ships were not based out of New Orleans or Savannah or Charleston. They were based out of Providence, Rhode Island, Boston, Massachusetts, later New York City. Portland, Maine had a pretty good branch at one time. They were New England flesh peddlers. I don't get into that a whole lot. I do tell some stories about them. One of them in particular, my favorite Civil War story was by Ida Lee Adkins. She was African American. Her mom was a house slave. Her father worked in the stables, and the master's name was Frank. And the old miss, the senior woman in the plantation, was Mary Jane. Ida Lee liked her master. He would go to Raleigh. It's about 60 miles. He'd do it twice a year. He'd always bring them back the children candy, hard rock candy, gumdrops, something like that. And Ida Lee had a sweet tooth. And she didn't care for Mary Jane as much because she thought Mary Jane had eyes in the back of her head. And every time that Ida Lee would try to steal a lump of sugar, she'd get caught. And so she could whip that head around faster than anybody I ever saw. And, that was a generation that believed in spare the rod, spoil the child. There was probably a spanking involved. Mm-hmm. She was 8 years old when the Yankees came. And Frank saw him coming. He grabbed a single-shot rifle and actually shot at the Yankees. But he missed, fortunately for him, and they overwhelmed him, tied him up, threw him on the ground, and started looting the plantation. They were stealing silverware. They got into the storehouse. They were taking up hams and so forth. There was a whole troop of Union cavalry. And Ida Lee tried to cut the master loose, but Union soldier stopped him and said, "Come here, you black brat," or words to that effect. "I'm going to cut your tongue out, alligator bait." And Ida Lee ran out the back door, which is probably what the Yankee wanted her to do. But she was a rapid thinker. They, by this point in the war, they didn't have any sugar in North Carolina. They sweetened everything with watermelon juice or honey. And they had bee boxes. They called them bee gums. They had quite a few of them outside the plantation house. Well, Ida Lee took a limb and knocked them over and started stirring up the bees until she said, "I could smell the poison." And then she took off, and the bees took off after her, and she ran right in the middle of the Union cavalry troop. Now, some of them were looting the plantation. Others were dismounted, holding their horses. Others were still in the saddle. And the bees started stinging the horses, and they started stinging the Yankees. And the horses started throwing the Yankees high into the air. And they were cursing, but as Ida Lee said, what does a bee care if you curse it? And the horses broke free, and the Yankees started chasing the horses, and the bees were chasing the Yankees. The Yankees, who were stealing things, they put them in pillowcases. They dropped them to try to fight off the bees. They dropped the meat, and they took off after their horses. And then the entire Union cavalry formation was totally routed. And this isn't supposed to happen. 8-year-old unarmed black girls are not supposed to be able to rout an entire troop of Yankee cavalry, but she did. And of course, after the Yankees fled, they hid the meat, they hid the silverware, and the old miss called Ida Lee over and said, "Ida Lee, you have saved us all." And she took a gold ring from her own finger and put it on Ida Lee's finger. And when the Federal writer interviewed Ida Lee in 1938, she was still wearing that ring. You know, given the poverty of the Reconstruction era and the New South era, it was probably the only piece of jewelry she ever owned. She's very proud of it. Anyway, I thought that was a cool story.
Oh, that's an awesome story. Kind of to piggyback off that, how important were women in the Confederate war effort?
Immensely important. The problem with women in the Confederate war effort is hard to quantify, but they did everything except fight, and some of them did that. But the Confederacy basically had no hospital service. The women set it up. They took care of it. I remember in the Battle of Mansfield, first book I wrote about the Civil War, every house in the town became a hospital, and the women took care of all the wounded soldiers. They ran the economy. They ran the plantation, the Ole Miss. Some people think the university there in Mississippi, Ole Miss, was named after this incredible woman. She ran the plantation while the man was off in war, and if it hadn't been for her, the Southern economy would have collapsed long before the Yankee got there. Their importance cannot be overstated. Matter of fact, General Sherman captured Savannah, and he ordered the Confederate women out. And they packed their suitcases, and they were ready to leave. And the Union officers decided they wanted to inspect the suitcases. And the women bowed up and said, "You will not. I will not allow you to put your dirty paws on my undergarments." And of course, they probably wanted to check them for jewelry and loot them, but the women wouldn't allow it. It ended up in front of General Sherman. And he said, "You Southern women are the hardest cases I have ever seen. The men would have given up long ago if it hadn't been for you." And then he turned to his officers and told them, "You cannot inspect their suitcases." So a little minor victory for the women. Oh, there were others. One of my favorite stories is the Nancy Harts. They were in LaGrange, Georgia. The original Nancy Hart, the one they named it after, was a woman who fought in the Continental Army under Washington, disguised herself as a man. But these women decided the Yankees might come, and they were going to have their own unit. They were going to defend the town of LaGrange, Georgia, from any Union incursions. And it's kind of funny when they started off, because women in those days are not like women today. They know nothing of firearms in those days. And they tried to train. One of them shot a bull by accident. Another one shot a hornet's nest. And that ended the festivities for the day. But they had a man named Dr. Ware, who was a veteran of Mexico, too old to go in the Confederate Army now, but he could train them. And they picked it up quickly. So when the Yankee cavalry appeared, there were women in combat formation with muskets and shotguns and rifles ready to contest them. The Union commander happened to be named LaGrange. He had no relation to the town, but he had been there. He had been wounded and captured, and they treated him, and he respected him and admired him. And he didn't want to kill women, and he didn't want to be killed by women either. So he ran up a white flag and met with the captain, and they made an agreement. The Yankees could take the town. They would not loot and they would not enter private homes. They would only burn Confederate military stores or installations. And they pretty much kept their word. And the women invited them to supper, and they had a big dinner. The men of the town had fought at Fort Tyler. Many of them were prisoners of war by then. And they were given a 24-hour parole so they could attend the dinner. And after it was over, the men were marched toward Macon, Georgia. But Colonel Grange learned that General Lee had surrendered, so he let them all go. It ended up well. But like I say, the role of women cannot be overstated. They were very inventive. There was one woman who it was in Arkansas. The Confederate Army was retreating, and she stopped the commander of the Confederate rear guard and said, "Are you going to fight before the Yankees get to my plantation?" And the commander said, "No, I'm not. The Yankees are 2 miles that away. They'll be here in 30 minutes." And he continued his retreat. Well, she knew if they got into her storehouse, they wouldn't have anything to eat that winter. And thinking quickly, she grabbed a ham, stuck a knife in it, twisted it, told the servants to throw it out in the yard. And most of what she had in her storehouse was ham, so she threw out some beef and all that. But they all had a hole in the side. And when the Yankee Vanguard commander arrived, he was astonished. He said, "What are all these hams doing in your lawn? The whole lawn is covered in hams." And she said, "Well, the Confederate cavalry did that, and you can eat them if you wish, but don't blame me when your men die of poisoning." And he looked at the ham, saw that hole in the side. He figured that's where the rebels put the poison. And when the Yankees left, none of the hams had been disturbed, and they had plenty to eat that winter. They were sharp. And there was a couple of occasions where one in particular in Arkansas, 2 boys from the Confederate Army got leave, and they showed up at one of the sisters' house. And the problem was it was behind Union lines, and the Union cavalry pulled up in the front yard. Somebody tipped them off the rebels were there. Well, one of the boys shinnied up the chimney and suspended himself where they couldn't see him. And the other one of the women was leaned up against the fireplace. He went right under her dress. And one of those big hoop skirts, he hid there. And the Yankees came in, and I hope the woman was his sister, but they went in and searched and couldn't find any rebels, and they decided it was a false tip, false lead, and they left, and both the boys got away. The women were, like I say, incredibly sharp.
Well, we've talked about oh, no. Do you need to say anything else?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I didn't interrupt you. We talked about your favorite stories. Now, here's something I want to ask. Who was your favorite rebel?
My favorite what?
Your favorite rebel. Maybe someone you connected to from their story.
Well, I wrote a book on Nathan Bedford Forrest entitled Bust Tail Wide Open. I guess he ranks at the top. But also one of them I really liked was Private Joe McBride. He was in the 45th Mississippi. And they were fighting in the Stone River campaign in the Battle of Terhune. He and his company commander, Captain Connor, who I got his memoirs, who I got the story from, they were cut off by Union Cavalry 4A. And they tried to escape, but it had rained earlier that day, and they came to a fence, and it was wet, and they couldn't get over it. And they were surrounded by Union cavalry. Well, they ordered them to surrender. Captain Connor threw up his arms, but McBride jumped on the Union commander, knocked him off his horse, took him to the ground. Before the Yankees could get him off, McBride had almost bitten off one of his fingers. He had it was hanging by a thread. He'd ruined the man's finger, and the Yankees, some of them wanted to shoot him, and others said, "No, you can't. He's a prisoner." I said, "Well, we'll let our commander decide." And they took him to General Peter Osterhaus, who was one of Lincoln's mercenaries. He was from Prussia. He did later stay in the U.S. Army and retired from it. But asked him, "General, what do you want us to do with this prisoner?" He looked him up and down and said, "I want you to accord him every right to do a prisoner of war, and I want every one of you to fight exactly like he did." McBride was cool. But there were a lot of them, like you'll run across a lot of very brave Confederates in this book. Did some remarkable things.
Awesome. We just talked about bravery. Here's an interesting question. What did the Confederate Army, how did the Confederate Army deal with cowards?
Well, very frequently they were court-martialed and shot, but more often than not, they let the enlisted men didn't bother the officers with the coward. They took care of him themselves. They would beat him out of the unit, shave half his beard, and give him a thorough thrashing, and let him know if he ever came back, it'd probably be worse. And they never did. They sent him home. Women didn't tolerate him either. Up in Farmville, Louisiana, there's a story. Everybody went off to war, including some of my ancestors. But there was one boy who wouldn't go. He was able-bodied. He just didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to fight. Well, a herd of women took him down on the sidewalk and put him in a dress. And history doesn't record whether they put makeup on him or not, but I hope they did. You were ostracized by the women. They would not tolerate boys who wouldn't join the colors. Kind of like General Forrest's attitude toward him. He had no respect for any young man who won't join the fight. And that's why it lasted 4 years.
Mm-hmm. All right. Talking about the Confederate soldier, did the Confederate soldier change during the war?
Oh, yes. Incredibly so. I don't know if you camp or not, but if you do, you've probably run across people who practically carry their whole homes with them when they go camping. I remember seeing one guy, he was out camping and he was cursing because he couldn't get enough television channels on his remote TV. That's not really camping, in my opinion. But the original Confederate soldier, the soldier of 1861, carried a remarkable collection of stuff. He had heavy boots with thick soles. He had a heavy coat with a long skirt. He had a small, stiff cap. He had a huge, long overcoat for the winter, frequently with a cape. He had a knapsack that was loaded with everything, including underwear, soap, towels, had to have a comb, a brush, a looking glass, toothbrush, writing paper, envelopes, pens, inks, boot polish. They actually polished their boots early in the war. Smoking tobacco, chewing tobacco, pipe, cotton strips in case you get wounded, needles, thread, button, tablespoon, knife, fork, etc. This knapsack alone would weigh 15 to 25 pounds and occasionally more. On the outside, he had 2 tightly folded blankets and a rubber oilcloth. The haversack was addition to the knapsack, and it was loaded with every kind of provision and potted meat or whatever. It had a canteen. It was always full of water. That changed. They found out water's heavy, and just filled enough to drink till they could think they could get to the next stream. They carried revolvers, which they decided was useless, and sent them home because their wife might need protection from marauders. They carried bowie knives and, of course, the rifle and the bayonet they always had. But they had flannel shirts and woolen shirts and gloves. But you can't do a whole lot with a pair of gloves on, so they discarded those. The flannel and woolen shirts were discarded in favor of a white cotton shirt because it was just as comfortable, easier to take care of, and not so prone to be infested by vermin and lice as woolen and flannel were. And each mess, a mess, 5 to 10 soldiers who ate together every night. They had large camp chests, and each company had a small wagon train to carry the baggage. This changed rapidly. The Confederate Army adopted the principle of less luggage equals less labor. So everything was discarded as they marched along. In 1861, you could tell where the Confederate Army was because of the items they would discharge on the or discard on the march. The boots were replaced by brogans, short shoe type things. Slouch hats replaced the caps. You had a short-waisted jacket, which replaced the long-tailed coats, and the overcoats were discarded altogether. The theory was it wasn't worth the effort to carry it in hot weather, and besides, when winter came, you could always get an overcoat from a dead Yankee, and frequently they did. The knapsack was discarded altogether. It's a general rule. Of course, it's Confederate Army. No general rule applies to every specific case. The clean clothes and underwear were discarded. You just had one man who had one set of underwear, which he was wearing, a shirt, pair of pants, a slouch hat, a rifle, bayonet, and a cartridge box, and haversack, and that was it. And the haversack didn't have much in it. There's enough provisions for the day, or maybe something you found on the march, like apples or blackberries, things like that. Tents were discarded. They became a rarity as the war went on. The Confederate soldier was stripped to fight. He would, and that's why he outmarched the Yankees so many times. He didn't burden himself with all these things. They discarded one of the blankets. Everybody had a rubber blanket and a regular blanket. And what they do, they put the rubber blanket on the ground. Two men would lie down on it. They used, each had a blanket, so you had two blankets to keep you warm. And they put another rubber blanket on top of it in case it rained. And that was sufficient for them. In fact, I thought it was a rather amusing incident with Pickett's division back when it was in North Carolina. They went to bed, and it was a perfectly clear night. But it snowed about 3 or 4 inches that night. And when the men woke up, they were covered in snow, and one of the officers was watching them. He said it looked like a mass resurrection. Everybody coming out of the snow, but everybody was fine. They learned to survive on just whatever they had. They ate hardtack and bacon, blue bacon, cured bacon, which was said to be particularly hideous. There was a joke in the Confederate Army that they went, "Our bacon outranks General Lee." And I thought that was about the way it probably was. Hardtack, I don't know. I'm sure you've seen some of it. It's very hard to eat. You have to boil it for an hour or two. I've got a piece over here. I'll never eat it, but I keep it around. in case I need to knock down a fully grown buffalo one day. But they didn't eat anything out of the ordinary. Everybody was always astonished that they could do what they did with as little as they had.
Well, I definitely am. We are going to take a quick commercial break, everybody. And when we get back, I got about 1 or 2 more questions left for Dr. Mitchum. So please start asking some questions in the chat about the book. I've seen a couple good ones about just history in general that you may be able to answer, Dr. Mitchum, or at least throw your 2 cents on. So make sure you send some questions related to the book. And we will be right back.
There is a place nestled in the rolling farmland of southern Middle Tennessee. A home constructed in 1837, nearly lost to the ravages of war. Saved by a servant and a Confederate general. A place where families loved and lost. If walls could talk, what stories could be told? If a place, a home, can feel love, loss, pain, surely this is one of those places. Nearby is a more recent structure, and inside are the stories of heroes and heroines, stories of battles won and lost. Stories of sacrifices made by the people of its native soil. A place that will tell the true and complete story of the Southland and the war fought for its freedom. From the causes that led to the conflict to the modern-day struggles to protect Southern history. Historic Elm Springs and the Confederate Museum at Elm Springs are the general headquarters for the Sons of Confederate Veterans. A place where the story of the Southland and its historic struggle is preserved and told. Come and discover your history.
All right, everybody. We're back from our Pop-Tart break. Remember to keep sending in some questions. And Dr. Mitchum's book, Voices from the Confederacy, link is in the chat below and scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Please go up there and use that link to support him. It's a great Christmas gift. It's a great book in general. I have it. So make sure you definitely go out there and you buy it for either your loved one, or if you want to treat yourself, you historians out there, I would definitely get it. These stories that have been passed down from generation that are in this book of the common soldier needs to be preserved and, of course, passed down in our own families. I would love to see my son read this book one day just so he can get a more wide variety of the Confederate soldier. Now, going back to some questions. I got about 2 more left. And remember, everybody, be sending in some good questions about Dr. Mitchum's book in the chat if you have any. We have some good ones on just historical topics, but make sure to send a good bit about his book as well. We talked about how the Confederate soldier changed over time. Now I'd like to ask you, did the character of the war change over time?
Yes, it did. In a way, it became more brutal. The Yankees were not content to wage war on the Confederate Army. They had to wage war on the Southern people. And that will be a controversy that will last forever. Was it necessary? Given the Union generals, I think it may have been. I think if Robert E. Lee had been commanding the Union Army, it would not have been. Grant, Sherman had little regard for the civilians, whether they lived or died. And, they talk about the Great War to liberate slavery. Well, how many African Americans starved to death because the Union Army scorched earth policy? James Downs wrote a book titled Sick for Freedom, and it should have been nominated for Pulitzer Prize, in my view. He talked about how many starved just in Sherman's march. He felt it was responsible for the death of 130,000 people at a minimum. He fairly well implies that it was probably a lot more. And who was at the bottom end of the economic scale? The African American. He estimated 80,000 of them starved to death as a result of Sherman's march. They had no respect for the blacks, had really no use for them. Many Northerners were, these were not integrationists. These people were highly prejudiced against black people. And matter of fact, Channel 12 in Jackson, Mississippi did a segment on their news about, you can get it on YouTube, entitled Concentration Camp Civil War. The Yankees did not call black people humans. They called them contraband, which is an item. It's roughly equal to the German word undermenschen or subhuman, which Hitler used to apply to Slavs and Jews, especially Jews, and gypsies during World War II. And at the end of the war, a lot of the blacks were infatuated with this idea of freedom. They wanted to try it out. And the population of Natchez increased by about 500%. Well, the Yankees put them in the first, in my view, the world's first concentration camps there in South Adams County. There were 3 of them. They called it the Devil's Punch Bowl. And 20,000 of them died of disease, being in close proximity to each other. And many of the blacks wanted to go back to slavery. Send me back to the plantation. Send me back to Massa. It beats this. At least they say what you want to about Massa. When he was around, there was usually something to eat. And that wasn't always true in this Devil's Punch Bowl. In fact, one of the things they brought out was this area later produced the sweetest peaches in the region. But none of the locals would eat them because they knew what fertilized them. You'll still find an occasional skull there. I wouldn't recommend you go. It's too close to the Mississippi. And if you do go, watch out for water moccasins. Carry a snake bite kit. But 20,000 dead in one concentration camp is quite a lot, and there were several of them. The black population was devastated by this. Downs, I think it was, estimated that of the 4 million blacks in the United States, 1 million of them either died or suffered serious health issues because of the maltreatment at the end of the war. There was no provision to take care of these people. Anyway, that's I go into that somewhat. I do it more, and it wasn't about slavery. Another book I wrote many moons ago.
Sounds like we might have to have you on to talk about that one.
I figured we already had. Yeah, you would enjoy that one. They're going to reissue it. It's completely sold out in hardback and paperback right now. But the publisher has decided to reissue it, and as soon as they get the paper from China, they will republish it. Now let's go, Brandon.
Yeah. But yeah, we'll definitely have to get you back on to talk about that one. Now here's my last question. We got a couple questions from the chat. A couple of them are pertaining just to history questions about educating themselves and where you found certain things, and other questions are specifically about your book. Jason Smith, the interim executive director at Beauvoir, said he appreciates you for all you have done for the cause and keeping history alive.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Come from him, that's means something. Thank you.
Here's a question that I have been waiting to ask. What are some generally accepted historical facts that you found to be false?
Well, not so much in this book, but that the war was all about slavery. It wasn't. General Grant owned slaves. General Sherman owned slaves when he was down here in Louisiana directing that military school. Grant, in fact, said if he thought the war was all about slavery, he'd take his sword and offer it to the other side. One interesting little caveat, and you'll see it several places I have, that Union General Stoneman was, of course, captured down in Georgia, Major General. And it's generally accepted that he was the highest ranking Union officer captured in the war. That isn't true. William Franklin was. He commanded a grand division in the Battle of Fredericksburg, 2 corps. He commanded a corps in Louisiana until he was wounded. But he was captured. He just wasn't held very long. It was Harry Gilmore, and he appears a lot in this book. He was a Confederate, eventually lieutenant colonel. They captured General Franklin, but they had ridden 2 days without sleeping. And he assigned a couple of men to guard him, and the guards fell asleep. And General Franklin was a very alert man. He took advantage of it, and he took off into the woods. So he made good his escape. He was only a prisoner for a few hours, but he was still a prisoner of war. And Colonel Gilmore said that he was very glad that his Christian friends were not around when he found out that Franklin had made good his escape. He wasn't very happy. But
I doubt it.
One. Of course, one of the other myths is that that's generally accepted. Myths get into history and they tend to multiply. I found that true when I wrote about World War II and Adolf Hitler. But one of the myths is that Earl Van Dorn was shot by Dr. Peters because he was fooling around with Dr. Peters' wife. Turns out that wasn't true. I wondered a little bit about it. I never researched it myself, but I figured if Mrs. Peters was a nymphomaniac, if Dr. Peters had shot everybody that she fooled around with, he would qualify as a mass murderer. Peters shot him because Van Dorn was fooling around with his 14-year-old daughter, in addition to her mother. And there's a lesson to be learned there. Don't fool around with teenage girls if they've got a daddy who knows how to shoot. In fact, he was arrested. Eventually, he was captured by Confederate authorities. And they put him on trial, and his lawyer wanted a private meeting with the judge. The judge consented. The 2 lawyers went into the judge's chamber with him. And the judge came out and dismissed the case. He didn't want the Confederacy to be discredited by this scandal. Incidentally, the 14-year-old was impregnated by Van Dorn, gave birth to a child, but that was several months after Van Dorn had died. Bridget Smith wrote a book about that, where elephants fought. Great piece of forensic history. But there are a lot of myths, mainly perpetuated in Yankee land. I think I wrote about it in the Confederate Veteran War by the Numbers, how they're trying now to inflate Confederate casualties. Confederate Army is unique in history. I mean, it's going to suffer 140,000 deaths 150 years after it ceased to exist. Pretty remarkable.
I say that's a talent I don't know many others could brag about. Jason Boshears, our commander-in-chief, just wanted to say wonderful research and details. These stories must be told. Thank you for all your work and sharing your knowledge.
Well, thank you very much. Praise from the commander-in-chief makes you feel good. Thank you very much.
Mr. Bobby asked, about the quote from Grant offering his sword to the other side. He says he has trouble finding a source for this. Where did you get yours for it?
Oh, I don't remember. It's pretty common, but I haven't. I would have to dig through the notes, which we don't have time to do.
Yes.
But sorry about that.
Oh, that's fine. I'm sure, Bobby, that, with a bit more research, you'll find it like Dr. Mitchum did. Sometimes sources, trust me, can be very hard to find. I am learning that out the hard way right now. So I'll see if I can try to help you, Bobby.
It's kind of funny with me in this War for Southern Independence. I've always been interested in it, but when it came time to launch my career, there was a genre among publishers. The editor said a book on the Civil War won't sell. Well, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If none of you guys will publish the book, of course it won't sell because it won't exist. And that was the situation in the late 1970s when I launched my career. But at that time, the movie Patton had just come out. There was an upswing in interest on the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Irvin Rommel. And I decided if I was going to write a book, I wanted it to be published. I was not looking for a custom fit in an off-the-rack world. So I wrote my first book. It was 920 typewritten pages, manual typewriter, no self-correcting feature. It'd kill me if I had to do it today. I bet the liquid paper added about 5 pounds of weight on the postage. And Macmillan agreed to publish it. I have a distinction. I sold my first book twice. A corporate conglomerate bought Macmillan. I got the corporate axe. So I had to find a new publisher. I tried for over a year. And, anytime you send off a manuscript and a letter comes back addressed to occupants, the news is not going to be good. And I sent it to a little house up in Massachusetts. And they wrote back, and their exact words were, "Gee, we'd like to publish it, but it's too damn big." I wish I'd kept the letter. But because they told me what I needed to know. I broke it into 3 books, made them campaign books rather than a biography. And those were the first 3 books I ever sold. Oh. And and then my editor wanted to know what I wanted to do next. And I said, well, I think I may do a book on the invasion of France in 1940 from the German point of view and a book on Hitler's field marshals and their battles. And he wrote back, don't scrap the one on France, but do the field marshals first. And I wrote back and said, no, I'm not going to do that. I've already started researching the Panzer Rally, they called it. And I'm going to do that one first. And he said, well, if you do the field marshals, I'll offer you a contract and I'll double your advance. And I was persuaded, and it just I just kept writing World War II till I'd written over 30 books. I was always interested in the Civil War, but I read things and I wouldn't take notes. I would remember the facts. I would remember where they came from. And I didn't get into the War for Southern Independence until they started tearing down our monuments. And that's when I switched over to the Confederate books. And I wrote Richard Taylor and the Red River Campaign was my first one. And Shotwell is going to publish a slightly expanded version of that next year. But that happened here, and I thought it was cool. Taylor had 8,800 men. He faced 32,000 Yankees. He tore them limb from limb, routed them, chased them all the way across Louisiana for 200 miles, surrounded them twice, cut off the Union fleet. It had to shoot its way out. And they just barely escaped with their lives. And I thought, what could be better? So that was my first Civil War book, if you will. But,
That's awesome.
Anyway, that's sort of my publishing history.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Albert Snow. Go ahead, sir.
I wish I'd kept notes on those books I read during my World War II phase. I can remember things stick with me, but book, page, year of publication, not one of those things. And you got any more questions for me there, Moose?
Yes, sir. Albert Snow asked, when he was in the Army, many things happened that was fun or funny. Do you have any such stories like that with the Confederate Army?
That's sprinkled throughout. I particularly like the story on the issue of dodging. Early in the war, some Southerners felt to dodge in combat, to dodge the enemy's bullets, was an unmanly thing to do. Others thought, no, I'm not going to be killed just for appearances. And it was an actual issue. Of course, as the people who wouldn't dodge got killed off, it became less of an issue. But during the 7 Days campaign, General Jeb Stuart had a captain, and this captain had to deliver a dispatch to General Stuart. And to do it, he had to go across a field that was under observation by a Union artillery battery. Well, he took off lickety-split, and they started firing at him, and he was riding Comanche style. He was almost parallel to the ground. They called it Comanche style in those days. So that horse was between him and any shrapnel, but it didn't hit him. He got there, and he was all right. And Stuart's staff, including the general, started making fun of the captain, who basically said, I don't care what you think. It made me feel better. And about that time, General Lee rode up, and they asked him where he stood on the issue of dodging. And he looked at the captain and said, that's right, Captain. Dodge them all you can. And the captain got even with Stuart in the Battle of Fredericksburg. Stuart was at the edge of a wood line looking through his binoculars when a Union artillery barrage went through the trees. I don't know if they were aiming at him or not, but it was certainly startling. And he hit the ground, and of course the artillery rounds tore up the trees and limbs, and foliage and leaves covered the general. It being wintertime, it wasn't, they weren't green, they were brown. And he dug himself up out of the foliage, and there was the captain standing above him laughing at him. I thought that was funny. But there was, I sprinkled some anecdotes. One Confederate soldier, by the end of the war, they didn't have much in the way of clothing. And he was invited to a dance, and he borrowed a friend's coat. Well, the friend was twice his size. With the coat on, you couldn't see the man's hands. And the women were the same way. This one woman wore a dress which was about 2 sizes too small, so she was about to pop out. And he asked her if she wanted to dance. And she said, yes, I do. And he said, yeah, well, we're going to present a comical couple. And she got furious, wouldn't dance with him, wouldn't speak to him again. But one girl said she'd go to a party. She's afraid to laugh. She had to borrow a friend's dress, and it was too small. And she was afraid if she let out a good belly laugh, her dress would rip off. They made a virtue out of necessity. They had starvation parties. That's kind of remarkable how well they kept up morale on the civilian front until, well, at least until after Nashville, I think. Morale had a big drop after that battle because the Army of Tennessee was virtually destroyed, and the handwriting was on the wall by that point. But anyway.
And here, this is going to be our last one for the evening. You might not be able to answer this one. It's one of those history questions that is not really on the topic for tonight. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on it. Someone asked, what would be some good pro-Southern books to use in their children's curriculum? They homeschool their kids.
Oh, my goodness. South Was Right comes to mind. I think it wasn't about slavery. It's kind of aimed at that, which I wrote, but that's self-serving, I guess.
No, go ahead.
But Gene Kaiser wrote a good book on it. There are a few of them out there. Abbeville Institute provides a lot of good videos for your children to watch. I wish I'd been around when I was homeschooling my kids. But those are some pretty good ones.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have any question? One more question on the book? If not, that's okay. I'll ask Dr. Mitchell. Do you have anything last you want to say on your book? Any story you want to add?
Well, I could add the ducking thing. The question is, who is the bravest Confederate general? Well, I think probably would come down Stephen Dill Lee or D.H. Hill. Or tell a story and bust hell wide open about Lee and Forrest decided to go watch a Confederate artillery battery fire on the Yankees. This young officer was very good at it. What they didn't know, there was a Union artillery battalion behind the hill. And they opened up and they stirred up a wasp nest, what they did, and they opened up on them and they hit an ammunition caisson, blew it up. Generally battered the Confederate battery pretty bad. And General Chalmers was there. He was Forrest's second in command. He hit the dirt and he looked up and he saw Stephen Dill Lee hadn't batted an eye or moved a hair. He was standing fully erect on his horse. And he said, I felt, they made me feel bad. Then a lieutenant rode up and he heard General Forrest, who was on the ground beside him, going, "Get out of here, get out of here." And he said, that made me feel better. But probably the bravest was Daniel Harvey Hill. He was peculiar, but he wouldn't dodge. In fact, if he thought a private was dodging too much, he would call him up under enemy fire. Said, "Come here, stand at attention, hand me your weapon." If it was loaded, he'd fire at the Yankees. If it wasn't loaded, he'd make him load the rifle, and then he'd fire it at the Yankees. And then they would discuss the shot while this man's at attention, and the general sitting on his horse, and both in full view of the enemy. And said, "Did I hit the Yankee? Did I kill him? If I didn't kill him, where did I hit him? You think he'll die? Did I miss? Where did I miss? What should I have done differently?" And they'd have to discuss it. Finally, when Hill got tired of doing that, he'd give the man back his rifle or musket and let him go back to a prone position. But Hill didn't have any fear. Stonewall Jackson didn't dodge. But, there was an incident in the Barksdale Brigade. There was a black man servant loaded down with Confederate Army gear heading to the rear. He had left Fredericksburg. And one of the rebel officers stopped him and said, "Where are you going, Uncle?" Said, "I'm running to the rear, sir." And said, "Whose unit do you belong to?" So, "I'm with Barksdale's brigade." So, and the officer asked him, "Is Barksdale's brigade running too?" And the servant said, "No, sir, they never run, but I always do."
Oh,
Well,
it is.
You got a good overview of the book.
Well, it's definitely been having a blast having you on again, Dr. Mitchum. Always good to have you on. We'll definitely start trying to plan a time when the new season comes out. I guess sometime in January. Please know the season finale of Look Around the Confederation will be this Thursday at 7 p.m. Confederate Standard Time, and this is the last one for the year, folks. So I need you to send in your news, your pictures, what your camp's been doing, and let's go out with a bang. I might have a guest, I might not. Depends on the news. Also depends on how I'm feeling. If I feel any better, if I can talk a bit more, we will have to see. And of course, if you want to get a copy either for yourself, giving yourself a little historian gift, I do that every Christmas almost, or getting a gift for your loved one, the link for Dr. Mitchum's book, Voices from the Confederacy, is below in the chat. Make sure you go and support him, and make sure you share this episode so we can get it out. Let's promote his book for him. Let's get some good promotion for Dr. Mitchum as Christmas time is going around. And remember, this Wednesday, if you did not get to see it on Facebook, AOT Councilman Carl Jones's talk will be live on YouTube at 7 p.m. Confederate Standard Time. So make sure you share that. Make sure you watch it if you weren't able to watch it on Facebook. And again, make sure to tune in this Thursday for the season finale of Look Around the Confederation. I've been your host, the Evening Moose, joined by the legendary scholar, Dr. Sandy Mitchum Jr. And remember, everyone,
it's a pleasure.
Oh, yes, sir. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And remember, no Fumar in the elevator. Good night, everybody.